Right now, multi-billion-dollar electric vehicle factories across the United States and Europe are quietly bracing for a supply chain heart attack. The future of Western high-tech industries no longer depends strictly on decisions made in Silicon Valley or Brussels. Instead, the entire global energy transition is holding its breath, waiting on the next move from a nameless tropical archipelago. That anonymous giant is Indonesia. Spanning a distance wider than the continental United States, it commands a population larger than Russia, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. You would naturally assume a nation of this staggering magnitude, one holding the literal master switch to tomorrow's technologies, would dominate daily intelligence briefings in Washington and Beijing. But when the media discusses global superpowers, this massive territory is almost entirely erased from the mainstream conversation. We are constantly trained to focus only on the loudest players on the geopolitical stage. However, to understand who is actually controlling the economic lifelines of the 21st century, we must uncover the silent empire hiding in plain sight. Centuries before anyone cared about underground metals or industrial supply chains, European armadas were already crossing treacherous oceans to secure a different kind of buried treasure. To comprehend the terrifying gravity of this region, you do not need to look at vast sweeping coastlines or massive tectonic plates. You only need to look at something small enough to fit inside the palm of your hand. That object is the nutmeg seed. During the 17th century, this peculiar wrinkled spice was not merely a kitchen ingredient used to flavor seasonal drinks. It was a supreme status symbol across Europe, wildly believed by elite physicians to cure the bubonic plague and ward off deadly infections. A single sack of nutmeg could easily buy a sprawling townhouse in the wealthiest districts of London or Amsterdam. This explosive demand collided with a brutal geographic reality. At that precise moment in history, the nutmeg tree grew nowhere else on Earth, except for a microscopic speck of volcanic rock in the vast Indonesian archipelago. These were the Banda Islands. Surrounded by deep, isolated waters, this tiny cluster of land masses suddenly became the absolute center of the global economy. Every major seafaring empire wanted a piece of the soil, but the local inhabitants had their own established trading networks with Asian and Arab merchants. The indigenous people refused to be locked into an exclusive, low-paying contract with any single European crown. That refusal set the stage for one of the darkest, most aggressively erased chapters of commercial history. The Dutch arrived with a singular, uncompromising obsession to control every single nutmeg seed leaving the soil. When local leaders attempted to bypass this forced monopoly and trade secretly with the English, the Dutch East India Company did not respond with renegotiated contracts or diplomatic envoys. In 1621, a newly appointed governor-general named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen sailed into the Banda waters. He brought a fleet of heavily armed warships and hundreds of hired mercenaries, determined to permanently silence the local defiance. The ensuing military campaign was not a battle over trade routes. It was an orchestrated annihilation. Cohen ordered the systematic execution of the community leaders, displaying their remains publicly to shatter any remaining resistance. In the span of a few agonizing months, a thriving indigenous population of roughly 15,000 Bandanese people was virtually wiped off the map. Those who were not killed outright were either starved in the mountains or captured and shipped away to serve as enslaved laborers on distant plantations. The native society was completely erased and instantly replaced by imported captives, forced to harvest the exact same trees that their predecessors had tended for generations. The staggering wealth pouring into the Dutch Golden Age was literally fertilized by this unspeakable human cost. Yet, even after this total physical domination, a tiny sliver of resistance remained to frustrate the European conquerors. While the Dutch held the primary islands, the British stubbornly occupied one isolated, muddy outpost nearby. This was the island of Run, Measuring barely 3 kilometers long and less than a kilometer wide, it was physically insignificant, lacking fresh water or a proper harbor. However, because nutmeg trees grew wildly in its dense forests, it represented a fatal crack in the absolute monopoly the Dutch had murdered thousands to achieve. Decades of naval skirmishes, economic sabotage, and brutal proxy wars were fought over this tiny patch of tropical mud. The financial exhaustion from these endless conflicts eventually forced the rival empires to the negotiating table to redraw the map of the world. In 1667, diplomats gathered to sign the historic Treaty of Breda, aiming to end the bloodshed and settle their territorial disputes once and for all. To finally secure the island of Run and seal their complete, undisputed control over the global nutmeg supply, the Dutch had to offer the British something of seemingly equal value. They agreed to formally surrender a distant forested settlement they had established on the eastern coast of North America. The Dutch had called this North American colony New Amsterdam. As soon as the ink dried on the Treaty of Breda, the British took official ownership of the territory and promptly renamed it. Today, that exact strip of land is known as Manhattan, the beating financial heart of New York City, the epicenter of modern global finance. The land that holds Wall Street and towering skyscrapers was traded away for a microscopic, rain-soaked island in Indonesia. The British gladly took the American woods, while the Dutch celebrated what they believed was the ultimate economic victory of the century. It sounds like a geopolitical hallucination today, a wildly imbalanced exchange that defies all modern logic. Yet, it perfectly captures the staggering, unseen power that this archipelago held over the destiny of empires. The wealth that built the grandest European capitals was not born from brilliant commerce or superior navigation alone. It was violently extracted from indigenous soil, driven by an obsession so deep that kings were willing to trade away the future capital of the world just to flavor their food. The true cost of that spice is still buried in the silent earth of the Banda Islands. Imagine standing on the eastern shores of Bali, looking out across the water. Just 35 kilometers away, clearly visible on a bright afternoon, lies the neighboring island of Lombok. To a casual observer, this narrow stretch of the Lombok Strait is just another routine ferry crossing in a nation defined by maritime travel. But if you step onto a boat in Bali and disembark in Lombok, you have not merely crossed a localized body of water, you have unknowingly leaped across a prehistoric chasm. You have jumped between two entirely separate worlds of biological life. In the mid-19th century, a British naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace spent 8 arduous years trekking through these dense equatorial forests, meticulously cataloging thousands of beetles, birds, and mammals. As he moved eastward through the islands, he noticed something profoundly unsettling. The wildlife did not slowly transition or gently mix as he traveled further away from the Asian mainland. Instead, it hit a sudden, invisible wall, right between Bali and Lombok, and extending northward between the islands of Borneo and Sulawesi. Wallace mapped a definitive jagged tear through the biosphere. Today, science calls this deep ocean trench the Wallace Line. For millions of years, the Earth's shifting climate dictated the movement of all terrestrial life. During the last ice age, global sea levels plummeted dramatically, exposing vast land bridges that connected major land masses. The western islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were physically fused to the Asian continent, allowing massive land mammals to roam freely across the dry plains. However, the Lombok Strait and the waters surrounding Sulawesi were unimaginably deep, forming a permanent, uncrossable moat even when the rest of the oceans receded. The animals were permanently trapped on their respective sides of the trench. Evolution proceeded in total, silent isolation. Because of this ancient geological lock, the western half of the Indonesian archipelago operates as an untamed extension of the Asian wilderness. If you wander into the humid, towering rainforests of Sumatra or Java, the canopy and the forest floor are dominated by familiar apex predators and heavy herbivores. Sumatran tigers stalk through the thick underbrush, while herds of wild elephants clear paths through the vegetation. Above them, orangutans swing through the ancient trees, sharing their habitat with rhinoceroses and leopards. This biological reality is deeply tied to the dense landmass of Greater Asia, sharing the exact same evolutionary bloodline as the jungles of India and Thailand. Cross that narrow, 35-kilometer stretch of water into the Eastern Territories, and that entire kingdom simply vanishes. The roaring tigers and heavy elephants are instantly gone, replaced by creatures that seem engineered by an entirely different creator. In the rugged terrains of Sulawesi and the sprawling, uncharted highlands of Papua, the wildlife is deeply allied with the distant continent of Australia. Here you will find marsupials like the bear cuscus, carrying their young in protective pouches. The skies are ruled by massive, vibrantly colored hornbills and cockatoos, while the ground belongs to prehistoric giants. On a few select eastern islands, the undisputed apex predator is not a sleek feline, but the Komodo dragon, a 3-meter-long carnivorous reptile. When modern societies build a new nation, they usually worry about uniting different spoken languages or bridging the gap between the rich and the poor. Politicians draft constitutions and draw maps to declare that a scattered collection of people now belongs to a single state. Yet, the physical reality of Indonesia fundamentally challenges how we understand the very concept of a unified country. The national borders drawn by the modern government in Jakarta are attempting to sew together a planetary fracture. Governing the sprawling hyper-modern metropolis of Java and the remote ancient highlands of Papua is not simply an administrative challenge for politicians. It is a surreal, almost impossible geographical feat. They are presiding over an environment that nature deliberately tore apart. To hold Indonesia together is to force two alien biological realms, two distinct halves of the globe that evolved in fierce isolation for millions of years to somehow live, breathe, and march forward beneath a single flag. When newly independent countries draw their borders and establish their governments, a predictable historical script almost always plays out. The demographic majority immediately seizes total cultural control over the new territory. They print the new currency, write the official state history, and most importantly, enforce their own mother tongue as the singular national language. It is a ruthless demographic arithmetic that has shaped modern statehood from the streets of 18th century Paris to the sprawling, conquered territories of the Soviet Union. The largest group always dictates the voice of the future. Yet deep in the equatorial tropics, one massive emerging republic completely broke this universal rule. At the dawn of its independence in 1945, the Indonesian archipelago was a staggering collection of different peoples, speaking over 700 distinct languages. Standing at the absolute center of this chaotic demographic map was the ethnic Javanese population. Residing primarily on the densely packed island of Java, they accounted for nearly 50% of the entire emerging nation. The Javanese possessed a highly sophisticated ancient language, complete with a complex written script, a rich aristocratic literature, and a deeply entrenched political elite. By every conventional measure of power, the Javanese language was the undisputed natural candidate to become the official voice of the new republic. If the founding fathers had simply followed the math, Javanese would have been imposed on every school and government office from the western tip of Sumatra to the eastern mountains of Papua. Instead, the Javanese elite orchestrated a stunning surrender of their own cultural supremacy. They deliberately bypassed their own mother tongue. They chose a completely different linguistic foundation for their country, a localized variant of Malay. At that pivotal historical moment, native Malay speakers made up less than 5% of the total population. Elevating a tiny minority language to rule a massive majority seems like a recipe for immediate political suicide or widespread social chaos. However, this decision was rooted in a brilliant, cold calculation for survival. While native Malay speakers were remarkably few, The language itself had served a very specific practical purpose for centuries. It was the traditional trading tongue of the coastal ports along the Strait of Malacca. Arab, Chinese, and Indian merchants had historically used simple Malay to negotiate spice trades across the scattered islands. It was a practical, egalitarian language of the docks and the marketplaces, completely free from the strict, hierarchical class divisions that heavily defined Javanese speech. The intellectual leaders of the independence movement realized a terrifying truth about their new geography. If they forced Javanese upon the hundreds of other ethnic groups, they would simply be replacing Dutch colonial oppression with a new form of Javanese cultural imperialism. The outer islands, fiercely proud of their own distinct identities, would instantly rebel against a newly minted Javanese empire. By voluntarily adopting the coastal trading language and renaming it Bahasa Indonesia, the Javanese majority made an unprecedented political sacrifice. They agreed to become linguistic foreigners in their own country, forcing themselves to learn a second language, just like every other ethnic minority. This calculated humility forged an incredibly resilient bond across the fragmented waters. It ensured that no single ethnic group could claim ultimate linguistic ownership over the national identity. Today, over 270 million people communicate flawlessly through Bahasa Indonesia, transforming it into one of the most widely spoken languages on the planet. A student in a remote highland village in Flores and a tech executive in a towering Jakarta office building meet on completely equal linguistic footing. The modern state did not unite its people through military force or forced assimilation. It survived and thrived because the strongest, loudest faction in the room deliberately chose to lower its voice, allowing a quiet, neutral whisper to bind a fractured world together. Stand in the sweltering heat of central Jakarta, specifically near the eastern edge of Merdeka Square, and you will witness an architectural impossibility in many parts of the modern world. Looming over the city skyline is the Istiqlal Mosque, the absolute largest Islamic place of worship in Southeast Asia, covered in massive white marble blocks and capable of holding well over 200,000 people at a single time. Yet, sharing the exact same street corner, standing literally across a narrow, bustling road, are the towering, dark neo-Gothic spires of the Jakarta Cathedral. This profound physical proximity is not a historical accident, nor is it a lingering remnant of colonial city planning. It was a deliberate, highly calculated blueprint drawn up by Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, in the mid-20th century. He understood a fundamental truth about human nature. Writing a national philosophy of unity on a piece of paper was easy, but making a highly fractured society actually live it required a heavy, immovable physical anchor. State ideologies almost always fail when they remain trapped in government textbooks. The Indonesian state ideology, famously known as Pancasila, dictates the belief in one God while simultaneously demanding the absolute unity of a population with wildly different faiths. Translating that high-minded philosophy into daily life happens right in the shared courtyard of these two massive religious buildings. During the Islamic holy day of Eid al-Fitr, the streets surrounding the Great Mosque are completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of worshippers arriving for the morning prayers. In response, the Jakarta Cathedral voluntarily opens its private iron gates, allowing thousands of Muslims to use the church grounds as a massive overflow parking lot. Months later, during the crowded midnight mass on Christmas Eve, the arrangement is perfectly reversed. Islamic clerics coordinate with church officials to provide parking and security for the incoming Christian congregation. Tolerance here is not an abstract political demand. It is a highly practical, everyday necessity. These types of urban designs and community actions which actively heal religious divides rarely make it onto the front pages of American newspapers or Western television screens. If you appreciate learning about these quiet, physical manifestations of peace that the global media often ignores, consider subscribing to this channel. We bring you stories that show how societies actually function beyond the political noise. Recently, the national government decided to make this invisible bond of tolerance permanently cast in concrete. In 2200, under the administration of President Joko Widodo, construction finished on a deeply symbolic public works project. Beneath the noisy, traffic-choked asphalt separating the two religious monuments, engineers carved out the Terowongan Silaturahmi, which directly translates to the Tunnel of Friendship. This brightly lit underground pedestrian walkway stretches for nearly 30 meters, literally connecting the basement of the Grand Mosque directly to the courtyard of the Catholic Church. The government did not build a tall wall to keep conflicting theological beliefs safely apart. Instead, they spent millions of dollars to bore a hole through the earth, ensuring that the two largest religious communities in the capital had a literal, unobstructed path to walk directly into each other's lives. To truly comprehend the survival of this sprawling archipelago, you must stop looking at their legal documents and start looking at their city planning. When diverse ethnic groups and rival theological beliefs are forced to share the same humid air, the same crowded sidewalks, and the exact same parking spaces, radical extremism finds very little room to breathe. The Ministry of Religious Affairs actively promotes this shared physical proximity across the country, replicating this spatial harmony in smaller towns and remote provinces, from Sumatra to Papua. You cannot easily demonize a different faith when their congregation guards your cars and sweeps your streets during your holiest days. Ultimately, the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral and the polished marble floors of the mosque serve a much higher purpose than simple theology. They are load-bearing pillars for a fragile nation. Indonesia holds its staggering diversity together not by forcing people to think the exact same way, but by forcing them to exist in the exact same physical reality. They survive by ensuring that the physical distance between vastly different worlds is never wider than a single city street. Walk through the bustling financial district of modern-day Jakarta, and you are immediately surrounded by towering monuments of economic triumph. Gleaming glass skyscrapers pierce the clouds, massive luxury shopping malls hum with endless activity, and millions of vehicles crawl through an infinitely expanding maze of concrete highways. To the untrained eye, this sprawling urban center appears to be an unstoppable engine of progress, firmly rooted in the earth. Yet beneath the polished marble floors and the heavy asphalt, a silent, irreversible catastrophe is unfolding. The sheer weight of this prosperity is quite literally crushing the very foundation it rests upon. For decades, the rapid expansion of the metropolis vastly outpaced its basic public infrastructure, because reliable piped water was historically denied to a large portion of the population. Millions of everyday residents alongside massive industrial factories and high-rise hotels resorted to a desperate alternative. They dug deep into the earth. They relentlessly pumped fresh drinking water directly from the ancient aquifers hidden far below the surface. This continuous, unyielding extraction slowly hollowed out the subterranean layers of dirt and rock. As the deep aquifers dried up, the empty spaces collapsed under the immense, growing gravity of the urban sprawl above. The city is not just sitting on the coast, it is actively deflating like a punctured tire. The speed of this physical collapse defies ordinary geological timelines. In the most severely affected coastal neighborhoods of North Jakarta, the ground is violently plunging downward at a staggering rate of up to 25 centimeters every single year. To put that severe number into perspective, that is more than double the global average for coastal subsidence. It is not a slow, imperceptible shift. It is an active, terrifying freefall. While the adjacent Java Sea slowly expands and rises due to a warming global climate, the concrete streets of the capital are simultaneously racing downward to meet the water. Hydrologists and urban planners have projected a terrifying mathematical certainty. If current trends continue unabated, by the year 2050, roughly one-third of the northern city will be permanently submerged beneath the ocean. This condemned zone is currently home to an estimated 4.9 million people. The traditional engineering response to rising tides has always been to pour more concrete and build higher, thicker seawalls. However, those defenses are entirely futile here. The ocean is not simply breaching the gates. The entire floor of the city is falling into the abyss. Confronted with an expiring, suffocating capital, the national leadership executed an extreme, almost unthinkable geographic pivot. They made the monumental decision to abandon the historic heart of the nation entirely. For over 4 centuries, the island of Java has been the undisputed epicenter of power, culture, and wealth in the archipelago, surviving colonial occupations and bloody wars of independence. To walk away from it is to sever a deep historical artery. Yet deep within the dense, ancient rainforests of East Kalimantan, located on the massive neighboring island of Borneo, fleets of heavy construction machinery are currently tearing a new future out of the tropical canopy. They have named this ambitious new territory Nusantara. Located approximately 200 kilometers away from the sinking, flooded streets of the old capital, this staggering $32 billion mega-project is aggressively marketed to the globe as a visionary leap forward. The government's glossy brochures and official press releases promise a green utopia. They broadcast images of smart grids, renewable energy, and perfectly balanced eco-cities. It is packaged as a masterstroke to redistribute wealth away from the overcrowded center and stimulate the neglected outer islands. But strip away the futuristic marketing and the optimistic diplomatic speeches, and a much heavier, darker truth remains. Moving the absolute political and administrative core of the 4th most populous nation on Earth into the middle of a remote jungle is not a proud, triumphant expansion of a rising empire. It is a desperate, large-scale survival retreat. It is a grim, physical acknowledgement that human engineering cannot infinitely outsmart the severe consequences of ecological abuse. Sometimes, when the land you have violently conquered finally fractures and gives way beneath your feet, the only remaining option is to pack up your civilization and run. To truly comprehend why this sprawling archipelago commands so much silent authority today, you must look away from its own rising skylines. Instead, you have to thoroughly examine the glaring physical vulnerabilities of the world's 2 undisputed economic heavyweights. The United States and China constantly project an image of absolute industrial invincibility to the rest of the globe. They possess the most lethal militaries on Earth, the most advanced semiconductor fabrication plants, and the deepest financial reserves in human history. Yet, beneath this terrifying technological facade, both of these global titans suffer from a severe geological deficiency. They simply do not contain the necessary dirt within their own sovereign borders to build the future they are aggressively racing toward. The grand, highly publicized visions of a carbon-neutral tomorrow rely entirely on extracting heavy, physical commodities from the ground. When a legacy automotive manufacturer in Detroit announces plans to transition its entire fleet to electric vehicles by the year 2035, that promise requires millions of tons of refined metals. Similarly, when the central government in Beijing pushes its Made in China 2025 inches initiative to dominate global clean energy, its massive factories in Shenzhen hit a hard geological wall. The critical ingredient required to make these high-density batteries hold a charge is nickel. The vast, overwhelming majority of that specific element sits buried deep beneath the equatorial mud of Southeast Asia. Neither the American Congress nor the Chinese Communist Party can legislate or magically manufacture these raw minerals out of thin air. This creates an astonishing dynamic of dependency for the wealthiest nations on Earth. If the massive cargo ports in Jakarta suddenly close their gates, or if local officials decide to halt ore shipments from the remote Maluku Islands, the global consequences are immediate and devastating. Gigafactories in Nevada and heavily automated assembly lines in Shanghai would inevitably grind to a complete halt within a matter of weeks. Ambitious climate initiatives like the multi-billion-dollar green subsidies drafted in European parliaments would instantly become meaningless pieces of paper without the physical materials to back them up. The entire global energy transition is essentially held hostage by the consent of a nation that Western news anchors rarely mention. These massive, multi-trillion-dollar economic engines are fundamentally crippled without the continuous, uninterrupted flow of resources from Indonesian soil. In centuries past, foreign empires viewed this immense chain of islands as a fatal weakness, a fractured territory that was incredibly easy to divide and colonize. Today, that exact same geographical fragmentation acts as an impenetrable steel shield against modern economic imperialism. You cannot easily launch a hostile corporate takeover or enforce a unilateral trade embargo on a nation that is physically spread across 17,000 separate landmasses and spans 3 distinct time zones. If a foreign entity attempts to aggressively dominate the mining and smelting operations in central Sulawesi, the national government can effortlessly pivot and turn to its vast, untouched reserves located hundreds of miles away in Halmahera or the deep highlands of Papua. The physical reality of the deep ocean trenches completely prevents any single superpower from swallowing the entire supply chain whole. It forces the world's most aggressive economies to sit down and negotiate rather than simply conquer by force. Beijing must continuously bid against Washington, and both capitals must ultimately bend to the strict regulatory demands imposed by local authorities. This vast watery expanse ensures that the immense wealth of the archipelago remains a highly contested prize that can be endlessly bargained for, but never fully monopolized by a single outside force. We are conditioned to measure global authority by the amount of noise a nation generates on the international stage. You rarely see diplomatic developments from Jakarta occupying the front page of the New York Times, nor do you see its domestic policies dominating the evening broadcasts of the BBC. Instead, Western media consumers are fed a continuous, overwhelming diet of political maneuvers made in Washington or economic declarations drafted in Beijing. These highly publicized daily events create a compelling illusion of who actually runs the modern world, forcing people to naturally assume that the loudest voices hold the most legitimate authority. Yet, true, enduring supremacy does not require a constant spotlight or endless press conferences. Absolute control is established when a nation quietly transforms itself into the unavoidable physical foundation of everyone else's future. This quiet dominance is not a new development for the archipelago. It is a historical constant that has simply evolved its physical form over the centuries. Back in the 17th century, the isolated volcanic dirt of the Banda Islands successfully held the entire European continent hostage over a handful of nutmeg seeds. The greatest naval armadas of the Dutch Empire and the British Crown waged incredibly bloody campaigns against one another, ultimately trading away future global capitals like Manhattan just to secure that singular agricultural prize. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the exact same geopolitical dynamic is playing out in real time. The world has simply swapped the wooden spice galleons of the past for the massive steel bulk carriers currently hauling processed nickel out of the Sulawesi coast. The specific raw materials have changed entirely, but the ultimate geographic gatekeeper holding the keys to the global economy remains exactly the same. While rival superpowers exhaust themselves fighting for ideological supremacy and digital dominance, Indonesia is busy cementing its ownership over the physical hardware of tomorrow. You cannot construct a high-tech, carbon-neutral society out of diplomatic treaties, software codes, or stock market speculation. Every electric vehicle battery rolling off a sleek assembly line in Germany and every massive solar grid storage unit installed in California requires thousands of tons of refined earthbound elements. By forcing massive foreign entities to build their multi-billion-dollar smelters locally in places like the Morowali Industrial Park, the national government is firmly anchoring foreign wealth directly to its own soil. They do not need to issue loud diplomatic threats or engage in aggressive military posturing to ensure their demands are met by the international community. They simply have to lock the warehouse doors and wait for the industrialized world to realize it has run out of essential supplies. There is a profound, chilling advantage to operating just outside the glaring focus of the global media apparatus. Constant international attention inevitably brings endless scrutiny, demanding allies, and highly paranoid adversaries, all fighting to actively disrupt your economic rise. By remaining quietly in the background, a nation can steadily and ruthlessly consolidate its grip on the global supply chain without triggering immediate, coordinated alarm bells. This is exactly why, while diplomats in Washington and Beijing openly threaten each other with semiconductor tariffs, officials in Jakarta are quietly signing multi-decade extraction contracts with both sides. The daily noise of global politics is ultimately a distraction from the heavy, unyielding physical reality of the Earth. The ultimate kingmaker of the modern era is never the one shouting the loudest on the crowded world stage. It is the one standing silently in the shadows, holding the only key to the vault that everyone else desperately needs to survive. If you want to continue uncovering the quiet, monumental forces that actually dictate our reality, hit the subscribe button below and join us for the next journey.